Welcome, everybody, to The Thoughtful Bro here this week with Dan Hornsby talking about his novel, Sucker. It is going to be a really fun interview. Dan is an amazing writer. This is his second book, and it is in one of my favorite genres, which is the kind of hubristic fall of the startup company, mixed with a little speculative too. So it's got so much that I like. A few quick words before we get started with the interview proper. Unless you've been living under a rock, you know that we are broadcasting live on A Mighty Blaze to Facebook, YouTube, and beyond. Thoughtful Bro is here every Tuesday at 2 to talk about what makes great books tick, what makes great authors tick. A Mighty Blaze is all volunteer. We started back right at the beginning of COVID to help writers reach readers virtually, and we're still going strong 3 years later. At A Mighty Blaze, we're never asking for money. If you want to show the love, all you have to do is tell your friends about us, like us, subscribe, repost us, retweet us, and follow us on all the platforms. If you want to spend money, I have an idea for you. You can open another browser tab right now and buy a hilarious book that satirizes startup culture with an unexpected horror twist. Books like Sucker by Daniel Hornsby. We will put a link in the chat to buy that through bookshop.org, who is our partner and support indie bookstores. If you have any comments or questions, please post them in the chat. If you post your comments, they will make their way on screen, and your questions will get asked at the end of the interview. We love questions, and I know Dan would be psyched for your questions too. So please just post them in the chat, and they will make their way to us. And now, on to this week's guest. Dan Hornsby was born in Muncie, Indiana. He holds an MFA in fiction from the University of Michigan, where he received the Hopwood Awards for both short fiction and the novel. He also has a Master's of Theological Studies from Harvard Divinity School. He is the author of the novel Via Negativa, and his stories and essays have appeared in the LA Review of Books, Electric Literature, the Missouri Review, and Joyland. He now lives in Minneapolis, Minnesota. His new book, Sucker, is a speculative fiction satire of Silicon Valley and has been pitched as Succession meets Bad Blood with a touch of the supernatural. Publishers Weekly called Sucker, quote, a gonzo, slow-burning speculative thriller. And the great Ron Charles, the legendary Ron Charles, reviewing in the Washington Post said, quote, what really keeps Sucker airborne is how it spreads its wings to embrace the whole nefarious network of super rich fiends who hang in the shadows and drain ordinary people dry. Poetic, accurate, excellent, Ron Charles. Dan, welcome to The Thoughtful Bro.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Before we get in here, I do want to thank you for just, licensing my mustache for the logo. Those checks really help me kind of make ends meet. So I appreciate it.
Dan, I have been not so quietly following your stylistic footsteps for so long. I mean, look at us.
I really do.
We could be related.
Yeah, here we are.
All right. So, Dan, the book is terrific. And I just want to start with no other place than the first line. And I don't think it's a spoiler to reveal what the first line of this book is. It literally made me laugh out loud. And I don't think I've laughed out loud at the first line of a book, maybe ever. But the first line is,
makes me happy.
I'm an American, so I always assumed I'd be famous. I just had to put the book down and start laughing. It's a great first line.
Thanks, man. I appreciate it. Yeah, it was kind of buried in the book for a long time. And then my buddy's like, just start the book with that. It kind of gets into this, the stuff about fame and notoriety that my narrator's obsessed with, and that my villain is kind of obsessed with too. So I'm glad you dig it.
Oh my God. I mean, it's just like tonally, it's just sort of like a thumbnail little character sketch all in one little sentence right there. But look, I have kind of yammered on here a little bit about what the book is about. Why don't you, in your own words, Dan, just give us the pitch for the book?
Yeah. So I would say, it's, follows kind of a parallel universe version of the Theranos saga, except we get a little bit, it's like Theranos as narrated by Martin Shkreli, if he had to get in there, with like a drizzling of vampires and punk bands. Does that work?
I think that's it.
Okay.
I think that's it.
You get kind of a rich bro, a wealthy guy who needs to get money from his parents' trust. And so he finds employment with his Harvard classmates' dubious startup. Mm-hmm. And so you kind of get this rich asshole is kind of telling this story, and you're seeing over his head a little bit,
So when I was getting ready for this interview, looked up the Theranos saga. I mean, I followed that saga from the beginning. I think it is just one of the most amazing stories, downfalls. I sort of never get tired of hearing how crazy that story is. But Elizabeth Holmes obviously duped people into thinking that she had made this machine that was going to revolutionize blood taking technology, and it was all a sham, and just a spectacular sham. And when I looked her up this morning, I saw that she is sentenced to prison for 11 years. She's in jail right now, and she was to be there for 11 years. And I just was sort of shocked by that, because I just thought these kinds of people don't normally ever get their comeuppance. I sort of vaguely knew she was in jail, but I mean, the fact that she's going to be there for 11 years sort of surprised me.
Yeah, I think of like a lot of these, it's almost an archetype in our culture now, the like tech CEO wizard, the founder wizard.
Yes.
And they all kind of exist on a spectrum of scammer and like legitimate business person. You know what I mean? Like Elon Musk, we know he didn't actually found PayPal. He founded X, which merged with PayPal.
Right.
He didn't found Tesla, right? He just like got in there fairly early. But he had, he makes it part of the legal process of kind of merger, buying these people out, to just make that his name, like make him a founder. You know what I mean? So he exists on a slightly scammy part of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there might have been some bribings to make like Tesla blue chip stock, for example. There's some rumors of that. And then you have like Adam Newman of WeWork, where it's like there were places, you know what I mean? Like that was a concrete thing. He didn't lie that they had buildings and things like that, but the finances were pretty icky. He was a scammer, really. He's like right there. Right. And then Elizabeth Holmes, I think, is like full scammer. She didn't have any stuff. Yep. It was a lie. And I think they really needed to kind of purge and punish her, because she embodies like this kind of anxiety that people have. Just, I'm sure if you're in that world, like, am I being scammed? You need to get the ones who are hardcore scammers out so people can kind of mid-scam. You know what I mean? Like, keep faking it till they make it, or don't.
I do. I mean, I was, as a reporter, I covered private equity and venture capital for more than a decade. And so I am like very, very familiar with that world. And it's part of like why I so obsessively followed the Theranos story, because, there is this kind of ultra gray zone, which you just so, eloquently put it, kind of everybody's on the scammer gamut somewhere, right? This whole idea of like fake it till you make it is actually viewed as kind of like that's the way of the road out in Silicon Valley. And it's like it is sort of the whole kind of like it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission. I mean, there's like a number of kind of like supremely asshole credos that are out in Silicon Valley, which like if you're not
fast, break things,
break things, all of that, all these things which seem quite morally questionable, but which is sort of how you're supposed to get it done. And if you're not doing it that way, then who are you really? But I think that like, to me, this has become like one of the best genres in storytelling. I mean, you mentioned WeWork. There was a show called We Crashed, which was great. There was The Dropout, which was actually about Elizabeth Holmes, which was great. There were some more complimentary ones, like the Steve Jobs movie was like sort of neutral. The Social Network about Mark Zuckerberg was sort of a little bit skeptical, but there's another one about Uber called Super Pumped, the battle for Uber. I guess here's my question for you. Like, why do you think this is such a kind of area of fascination for our culture right now?
Yeah. Well, I think that, they fit into, coming out of the 2008 crash, right? Yeah. Tech was this kind of savior sector of the economy. Right? Like everyone was like, I'm gonna do a boot camp. I'm gonna study computer science. And so I think for, people our age, these are these kind of like, for a while they were like Christ-like figures. You know what I mean? They were iconic. And I think Steve Jobs really is the one, right? Where it's like he took all our fascination with artists, and kind of became this like tech Bob Dylan for everybody. And obviously he's a holdover from a different generation, but really like embodied that for people and laid the groundwork for this kind of narrative. And, it's like, I think, I'm trying to think like the tech wizard, especially, I think like they are creatures of narrative, right? Like you think about the stock market is all about stories. Like a story leaks, it changes. It changes the stock market. And the same thing goes for the valuation of these companies, and how they raise money. They have to tell stories, right? And so they become like absorbed into, they're easily narrativized. They narrativize themselves and often lie about the dinginess and size of their garages or their parents' wealth or something like that. But I think, for a while, like, we grow up, the Y2K is coming. We imagine we're going to be in flying cars. And these guys are kind of like the tech wizards that I think a lot of people just had faith in them as like, they're going to reshape reality and make things easier. And it really hasn't been the case. Things have stagnated.
Yeah, and I think what's sort of interesting to me is, you went to Harvard Divinity School, and I can't wait to talk to you about that and kind of how you see some of what you studied there is kind of informing your work. But one way to make a little bit of a bridge towards a more spiritual kind of religious topic is this idea of like the way that some of these figures have become so much more than just business people. I mean, they're just business people, and they're making products that they want to sell for a profit. But there is like a way that, especially with Steve Jobs, obviously he's the one where it's like, they were like culture heroes. And, there's this famous old phrase, mankind has to worship God or worship something else in his place. And I mean, not to sound too grandiose about it, but there is a way that it's sort of, I think, a singular moment in our American culture where I don't know if that moment has passed now, but certainly is only recently passed, if it's passed at all, of like these tech engineers being something more than business people trying to make money.
Yeah, and I think it's like very deliberately part of their PR. You think about like, you think about the kind of quest for immortality that a lot of these people pursue. They're the rumors of the blood boys, the teens who are, giving their blood to Peter Thiel.
No, I know Thiel's got a lot schemes, but I didn't.
He's got a lot of schemes. I'm afraid of that guy. So Pete, if you're watching, it's all good. But Space Bezos, Elon Musk trying to pull some of these sci-fi stunts. I think they're really trying to push that they're masters of our reality, or they're trying to make new realities to be masters of.
Yeah.
And they're all they come up on kind of dim and flat readings of science fiction, and I think they see them as kind of Asimovian shapers of history. It really does feel kind of like adjacent to maybe late 19th century tycoons.
Yes.
Who seem to epitomize not only like they're the centers not only of like power, but they actually symbolize something, right? Like people are supposed to aspire to what they are. It's not just being rich.
There's almost, Dan, like a moral thread in it. I mean, like Carnegie kind of back in the day, kind of just this idea of like this, that whole period of like kind of in the Industrial Revolution in the late 1800s, this kind of progressive era, like we're just sort of making the world better through machines. It just felt like there was a kind of, this is how you be a good, wholesome American person, is kind of through being one of these. I mean, you could be a plutocrat and be a completely wholesome.
Isn't it insane that we look back at those guys who are some of the richest people ever to exist and be like, they're better than our super rich people.
Right. Totally.
You know what I mean? Where they have like children, like putting pencil shavings into sausages. And we're like, well, they're better than these guys. But yeah, I also think, there's some cultural insecurity, competition with like Europe and other parts of the world where they're like, we need library. We want to, you know what I mean? Where they wanted to kind of, have a shape culture in these ways. So they build music halls and libraries, but it seems like that's a lot better than, I don't know, shoving iPads into kids' faces or hoarding your money.
I think at the risk of like belaboring this slightly longer, I don't think it's
it's fun.
I love this topic.
It's part of the book. Yeah.
It's part of the book. And I think, one of the most kind of like, to me, like tone deaf slogans, or kind of like non-self-aware like corporate slogans of all time, was Google's slogan, "Don't be evil," back in the day. I mean, that just had all the hubris in it that we're talking about. And I think that like part of the reason why Silicon Valley like sort of got a pass for so long is because it was like in this perfect blind spot for the left and the right. Like on the
100%,
left, right? Like on the left, it's like, here's like highly educated young ambitious brainiacs who want to change the world. I mean, hey, that's a Democrat for you, right? And on the right, they're like, here are like big business people who like want to like capitalize on the free markets. Hey, that's a Republican, you know? And so, but so neither side could criticize Silicon Valley for a second.
It was right in the corporatist sweet spot, right? And I think you have like the Peter Thiels who are libertarians who can kind of like kowtow over here and kind of take some of those military contracts maybe other people don't want to take, like Google or something. I don't know. And then on the left, I do think like you have this hand-me-down from hippie culture, right? Like these people, it's like, oh, Steve Jobs likes Bob Dylan. I like Bob Dylan. Hey, cool. You know what I mean? Where it seems countercultural when in fact, what's the joke? You know, the Woody Guthrie guitar, it's like this machine kills fascists.
Yes.
And then it's like this fascist builds machines, you know what I mean? Like, or whatever.
I hadn't heard that.
That's great. I think my wife or one of her friends told me that. But, you know, I think it really managed. And, you know, this is a thing about like having an economy that crashes every 8 to 12 years, right? Is that like we surrender our values in the face of crisis. And I think technology especially is this place where, like, you know, you think about how polarized the country is now. We essentially default to what we are technologically capable of. Right? Like we could use drones, and so we used drones. Right? You couldn't move the needle. You know what I'm saying? Like, we just do things, and then we realize, oh, actually, that stuff is killing us, you know?
Yeah, I do think there's just sort of, I mean, this is a much larger topic, but there just seems to be a kind of like moral neutrality to all technological developments, right? It's like the moment you have an airplane that can like save somebody by flying them to a hospital, that same airplane like drops bombs on the next flight. And like,
100%.
You know, so.
Well, and I think, you know, it's really our job. I mean, this is what like books can do, right? It's like, not to be like, oh, books are going to save the world or anything, but like, you know, I think we need to imagine a future where we have like education in ethics, and we like actually talk about and try to like shape a vision for the future that doesn't just default to business or technology. Like, what do we believe in, and what kind of world do we want to create? And I think that like we've really stalled to the benefit of corporations and tech.
All right. Let's keep moving. Clearly, this is a topic that animates the both of us. But another major aspect of this book is the quest for eternal life. That is, there's massive twists in this book, so I'm kind of choosing my words carefully.
You can blow it too. I think, you know, it's. I try to signal some of this stuff as you read, so people will pick up on it. It's like talking about Terminator 2. You're like, okay, Arnold's good, whatever. Let's just keep moving. You know?
Right. So the cover gives it away a little bit, but there is a certain kind of mythic horror being that has to do with blood and sucking blood, who is part of this story. But you know. What's interesting is this kind of quest for eternal life. You touched on it earlier with Peter Thiel, and I'm sure there's all stuff that Peter Thiel and his ilk are doing that we will only hear about 50 years from now. But this is a real thing. I mean, there's this guy, Aubrey de Grey, who's given like a TED Talk about it. I've seen other people out there who talk about, you know, the first person to live to 1,000 years old is already alive. And yes. So I just think
I'm just in my 860s, guys. I'm still young.
860 is the new 760.
Yeah. Oh yeah, man. Come on.
I guess so. Just to put a point on this, I'm happy to hear you say anything you want about this kind of idea of like eternal life and how that is something that people legitimately talk about. But do you believe in it? I mean, do you think that this is a thing, or is it just sort of like a device for your story in your eyes?
I think like the desire for it is incredibly real. And I mean, if you think about the lifespan of, say, like, you know, I think there have been, you know, because of certain factors, like the lifespan in the US has kind of stalled a little bit, but like old people get to be older. Like, I think that's indisputable. Like the old people that get to be old can get older than they used to. And like, it's not like, to me, if it's like you or me, we live to be over 100, that wouldn't surprise me, you know, just like the way things are going. At the same time, I just think it's like so silly that, you know, the hypocrisy of kind of burning the world down, destroying the world so that you can live forever in a hell of your own making. I find it funny. and fucked up. But
Yeah.
like, that like these people are manipulating politics, in some cases trying to like get some coups going in South America, right? So that they can like live forever in a bunker,
Yeah.
like they have no kind of like vision of sharing that wealth, or like the fact that you're going to need a world, with flora and fauna and people if you're going to enjoy life at all.
Totally.
You know,
It's totally crazy to me. And also, I mean, there was another author I had on a while back. We were talking about this issue, kind of came to this issue in a different way, but he sort of made the point that like, look, so let's say you build this eternity machine and you're able to kind of like freeze yourself or rebirth yourself, in 1,000 years, or maintain yourself.
Yeah.
Like at some point, like that, it's gonna, whatever you're doing requires energy, right? Like say you've and it's like, who knows if future generations will like you don't know the world in 1,000 years. Like, will that be a world where people like want to keep your cryogenic machine going or whatever? I mean, let's just say you could live for 2,000 years. Like, who knows what that world would even look like, or if it'll be hospitable to you. It just seems so ridiculous.
Right. What is it? It's my friend, he studies the phenomenologist Merleau-Ponty, and he has this epigraph from the beginning of one of Merleau-Ponty's books, by the author of The Little Prince. And he says, like, human beings are knots of relations. And that accounts for almost the whole of what we are.
Right.
You know what I mean? That we don't,
Yes.
They want to have a kind of extractable self.
Yes.
That has like attained some kind of godhood. But the truth is, like, your life has meaning in a kind of lattice, right? And part of that is ecological, part of that's cultural, it's family, it's friends, right? And it's like, if you're to extract yourself from that, are you yourself? Like, do you know what I'm saying? Like,
that is so beautifully said, Dan. I totally agree. Yes.
And I think like the one thing that I'm convinced of with them is like, they believe everything is extractable. They believe the consciousness is extractable from the body.
Right.
Yeah. And so I think it's kind of part of the vampirism.
It's part of the vampirism, right? Like, you're just sucking everything else out. Why can't you just suck out yourself and then...
Yeah. And then live forever in a god bod.
All
right. Get a nice shiny god bod. Sounds cool. I mean,
speaking of god bod, pivoting to the god, I love that you went to Harvard Divinity School. I mean, I've always been interested in reading about philosophy and spirituality and the psychology of religion. And, I just want to just turn back the clock here and just let's talk about your Harvard Divinity School degree, because it's going to tie into this book eventually. But like, to begin this line of questioning, can you just tell me, like, what were you studying there?
Yeah, so I already, I did my MFA in fiction, and I like started writing my first book while I was in div school. I just realized I was like interested in the history of religious ideas, right? And that like once you start pulling at that string, like, oh well, if it's in the Christian tradition, like obviously you need to know some stuff about Judaism too, and all of a sudden you're just like hit with thousands of years of text and history. And so once you start pulling those threads, it just made sense to like take a couple of years and read and think, and kind of, but I was doing it kind of, as a fiction writer, which is a little more elective. I wasn't trying to like write a thesis about, the Desert Fathers in Lower Egypt. I could just take a class, write a few papers, read some books. And the same goes. So like, early Christianity, and then a lot of kind of medieval stuff once people are writing in the vernacular.
Right.
So, that's Julian of Norwich, Meckfield of Magdeburg, that kind of crew.
But did you have a vision then? It's so interesting that you got your MFA first and then went to Harvard Divinity School and then kind of ended up being a published novelist, that like, that the Divinity School thing was kind of sort of sandwiched in between this kind of thread of you being a creative writer. So were you there kind of the whole time, in a sense, like thinking like, well, this is just going to feed my ultimate creative output, and that's why I'm here?
I mean, yes and no. I just think like as writers, our ideas are really important, or not our ideas, but learning how to navigate and make ideas kiss in a book is hugely important. And the stuff that we're trying to figure out, I think, is like, you're not trying to write something with a thesis. You're not trying to solve a mystery. You're just trying to like sit beside the mystery for a little bit, when you read a book. Like Moby Dick doesn't solve anything,
Right.
right? It just kind of brings you closer to this kind of abyss, you know,
Right.
or some kind of mystery of being. And so I don't know. I think one thing that I really learned while I was there is just like I was trying to figure out ways to make like ideas touch
Yeah.
and find a way into like for me, you know, the books I really love, they kind of connect things in associative, dreamlike ways that you just can't do in other forms. Maybe poetry could do it, but you know what I mean. Like it's just intuitive in the novel. It's been a part of the novel for a long time. Yeah, and so I still think like some of what I put together there, it still informs what I do, even if I'm writing about vampires or eco-terrorists or something like
Right.
that.
Well, can you tell me kind of how? Okay, let me start over.
Yeah.
One thing that's interesting about so much of spiritual literature, and what I love about spiritual literature is like the storytelling aspect of it. I had a woman on my show a while back who translated the New Testament, and she was telling me about how the New Testament developed in the first century. And she was saying, like you got to understand, like this was sort of like Saturday Night Live. It's like all these like these stories and like all these parables of Jesus. They're almost jokes, you know.
They're like jokes, right?
They're like
they have
jokes.
A setup. And
Yes.
they have a punchline that subverts the premise, right?
That's right.
Yeah,
That's right. And so to me, like, I mean, and I love parables. When I was raised Christian, I love these parables of Jesus. I do think they're very funny and insightful, obviously. And, you know, so much of great, you know, rabbinical literature is like that. And the Analects of Confucius is like that.
Sure.
There's a lot
some Japanese koans are like that, like
100%,
Zen koans, right?
So I guess, so my question to you is just like, tell me what your view is on kind of like the link between, you know, spiritual storytelling traditions and the novel. And do you feel like you're sort of somewhere in between those, or you're fully a novelist or whatever?
I mean, what I really like about parables, you know, you could lump the sayings of the Desert Fathers maybe into those kind of wisdom traditions, right? Like you said, they do have a joke-like air to them. And they're like truly parabolic, right? They come up very close to something and kind of just almost skirt the mystery of it, right? Like they almost get there, and they make you have to kind of figure it out while still like conveying this thing, which, you know, in the form of a joke is a, you know, it's a laugh, this involuntary kind of response. I think in literature, I still am kind of motivated by humor and like what like funny to me isn't just like a guy falling on a banana peel, even though I do think that's funny. I'm sorry. Or like Murphy beds. I do think Murphy beds are funny. But there's also like when somebody puts like a really Latinate construction next to a really Germanic construction and you get this little pop of language. Describing a child's head as shiny like an onion. Or Charles Portis, I think, describes an old man as having pearly shins. Like that's funny to me, even though it's not like a boom joke. It's just there's some quality to that that's kind of ineffable and amusing to me that kind of motivates me. And I do think, you know, like religious writing, thinking about this for most of the tradition, unless you get into like really the weeds of like more contemporary and orthodox stuff, people are trying to get at the truth of their predicament,
right?
You know, and I do think that I'm touched by that.
Yeah.
You know, and, you know, I think that's what we have to do as novelists too, is at least like try in a non-prescriptive way to get at the heart of what we're experiencing, you know?
Oh, I love that.
Does that
I mean,
make
if
sense?
you're not doing that, what are you doing, really? I mean, in my eyes, I come to literature for the mystery and to kind of like the framing of the problem, you know?
Yeah. Which is like done through like characters and conversation, just like in life.
Yeah.
You know, it's like somebody can't. That's why all those wisdom teachers, they don't just give you the answer, right? They just kind of like bend the question a little bit more, because ultimately it's going to have to be something that comes from your own experiences, conversations, you know, that kind of thing.
Now, Dave, before we move on from the religion, philosophical wisdom aspect of this conversation, this is a massive question, and please just kind of take this any way you want.
Lay it on me.
Like, you've spent a lot of time thinking about clearly about religion, religious history. You've also spent a lot of time thinking about capitalism and America and American culture. These things are in huge on every page of this book. You're seeing these things. Where are we in America spiritually?
Oh, yeah. Oh man, that's really hard to say.
I know it's too big of a question
I think, we're at a point where, like, I think a certain brand of Christianity has like distilled itself into kind of an ethno-fascist zone. Where it's like just slowly for the past, I would say since the 70s and the kind of muscular Christianity stuff, whittled away the like social gospel and all of this stuff to have something that like is very scary and is aligned with, kind of corporate interests and essentially is like, violent and terrifying. And it doesn't leave any kind of wiggle room for like a lot of conversation or dialogue. It really, by definition, kind of precludes that. And so, yeah, when I was in div school, it was interesting. I grew up in Indiana and went to kind of a very strict Catholic school, went to mass every day.
Yeah.
So like the only day I didn't go to mass up until the 8th grade was Saturday, if that gives you an idea of how much mass I got. I think I just ran out. Like if I banked them, I was like, if I didn't go after the 8th grade, I think I like just ran out of them at like age 32. But it's a very strict environment and very conservative, but also had a lot of lateral drift from evangelical Christianity just because of where we were. My parents knew a lot of people. Sometimes we'd go to like People of Praise, which is like a very conservative and almost Pentecostal thing. Amy Coney Barrett, I think, is still involved in that, the Supreme Court justice. So I saw a lot of like them. And then, then we went to like a liberal Catholic church on Sundays that my parents enjoyed. So I kind of saw this weird spectrum. My uncle was a Franciscan. And, he was very much invested in kind of helping people. He ran a soup kitchen later on in his life after he left them. So, like going to Boston and doing the div school thing, I saw a lot more kind of socially minded articulations of Christianity. You know what I mean? And so I do think that like those people are there and they'll probably, they have a part to play in kind of figuring out this mess on the other side of things.
Yeah.
But it is hard to overstate just how powerful that scary thing is, the kind of Christo-fascist thing is, which is like, I don't know. I think it's kind of the elephant in the room.
Well, I mean, now it is kind of beyond parody.
It's the room,
now,
maybe.
Where you see these giant kind of posters and T-shirts and paraphernalia with Trump and Jesus blended together. I mean, that is just a standard
so crazy
thing now. I mean, I'm just speechless. And I come from a kind of a similar background to you in the sense that like, I went to Jesuit schools. My father is a teacher at Holy Cross College. And, in the summer we would go away with kind of other professors of Jesuit schools and we would go to mass every day. And I kind of went to Catholic school my whole life. And my issues with Catholicism are sort of not, in my view, with the heart of the teaching and sort of what I experienced, which was very kind of folk religion and kind of, so totally socially minded. And all about just helping other people and singing Kumbaya, I mean, like literally. So I don't have any issue with like what I view as the heart of Christianity, but I agree with you that it's sort of gotten to the point where it's just another aspect of a political platform and it's corporatized, as you said. So one last question on this topic. Where do you see what makes you the most hopeful in terms of the American spiritual landscape?
Oh, yeah. I do, it's like I've met a lot of people who like, okay, that kind of version of Christianity that we've been describing, the kind of Nazi adjacent Christianity,
right?
A lot of defectors, a lot of people leave, right? Like you look at, I don't know, like the Duggars or whatever, they have people who leave, you look at kind of any group thing. That's why they put all of this emphasis, I think, on reproduction. Because it's like just inevitable that people will jump ship on that stuff. I think I guess my hope is just that, like, in people's lived experience, they might see the truth, on their own, that some of this stuff is almost self-evident,
Yeah.
and that they'll abandon it as they realize that it's life denying.
Right.
But I also see, people like, I don't know. The more I talk to, like, I do a lot of writing at a coffee shop, and then I go to like an Eagles club,
Mm-hmm.
just a classic kind of neighborhood bar at night. And like, people are pretty, I don't know. It seems like people are pretty literate with ideas, like across
Mm-hmm.
the board, all walks of life. People have like real insight into our mess.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, now every now and then you talk about ancient aliens or something like that. But I do see a lot of people like who have interesting points of view, and I think that like things might change because of that. I think
Yeah.
like there has been this kind of bloom in omnivorous ideas. Yeah, I guess I have some hope in that. I know
Love
it's a
that.
mess. It's all a mess,
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I feel sort of the same way in a nutshell, which is that I always get sort of depressed when I'm alone reading about the state of the world. But then when you actually go out into the state of the world and talk to other human beings, it's never as bad as you kind of think on your own in your basement,
Right. And some people, the place I hang out, there's a guy who will show up in a Trump shirt, and then the next day shows up in a Cramps shirt, and a guy's like, he's just trying to get a rise out of people. And you can tell there's like enough cognitive dissonance in that
Right.
guy.
Right.
Like, he's not 100% for some of the hateful shit he's kind of putting forth. Like,
Right.
there are cracks in that facade.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I do. All right. We're going to do a few more questions about craft, but folks, just put your questions in the chat if you have some. I know we already got a couple that came in ahead of the interview, but we'll get to the questions in about 5 minutes. Just let's talk for a moment, Dan, about craft.
Yeah.
In your acknowledgments, you thanked Peter Ho Davies as a mentor. Now, I had Peter on the show, and I have friends who know Peter. I mean, Peter is like this beloved figure.
Oh, I love him. Yeah, he really is a saint.
He's like a saint. I mean, he's in that kind of Saunders-esque pantheon for me.
Oh yeah,
and just he's one of those guys like Saunders too, who when they talk, it just comes out in this kind of mellifluous clarity. I mean, everything he says is just so full of wisdom and insight. But I just wanted to kind of open the floor to a little Peter Ho Davies talk here. Can you just talk about what that mentorship was for you and kind of like what you learned from him?
Yeah. So I have quite a few classes with Peter. I think maybe two workshops. And then I did this really good kind of history of the short story for writers class.
Mm-hmm.
And that class like really kind of blew my mind a little bit, because it's like we would kind of like, okay, we're reading Kafka this week, and then he'd also be like, and do an imitation of Kafka, and we would all submit them, and then he would kind of pick like, oh, the style here of this kind of you know what I mean, like the syntax, the word choice, like can you get there, Chekhov, we just kind of work our way through. And the kind of insight, I think, into like the way in which things on the like syntactical level, the sentence level, the paragraph, just in the like bare mechanics and how they kind of like translate into the ideas that you're playing with.
Mm-hmm.
Like seeing that and playing in that space every week was just very illuminating for me. He also is somebody, I think, who does this thing in his writing, but also teaching. Like he has that perfect kind of emotional balance of like warm and cold, where he can like zoom out and look at something and then get at the emotional heart of something. I think he's also kind of joke motivated too. Yeah. And so I don't know, having him as a teacher where it's like he felt like somebody who really focused on the possibility. I'm like choked up thinking about him, honestly, but like really could kind of like, I don't know. It was like, just with him, it was very close to the heart. You know what I mean? Like you could just tell that it mattered. These decisions on a big level or a small level. Yeah. I don't know. Just kind of a great teacher. Yeah. Love that guy. Love that guy, man.
I know.
Oh God.
I
feel choked up thinking about it, man. I don't know.
See, I knew. I mean, I wouldn't have brought him up. I wouldn't have brought him up otherwise. I mean, but I think even, I read some of his books and then I had him on the show, and he also had that effect on me just in terms of like, I mean, I wish he had been my mentor. I mean, he just this kind of gentle, confident way of like,
I know.
it's going to be okay. You're going to do it. And this whole enterprise has enormous dignity and meaning, you know?
Yeah. And he's still fun. Like one time he read this story at some, MFA thing about like the hunger artist's mother, the Kafka story. And then like, this is from the point of view of the mom of the hunger artist, where you're like, oh, that is like perfect. You know what I mean? Like it's about being the parent of an artist, but like, especially as a mother being, your kid is giving up food, it reflects on you. Just like if your kid writes a novel that has a character like you in it, you know
Totally.
what I mean? It's just perfect. So love that guy.
Yeah, Peter Ho Davies, folks, check him out. We'll post a link to the interview I did with him, and then also to some of his books. But Peter Ho Davies, just an amazing guy. One last craft question, and then we'll take some audience questions. This is your second book. I know you're working on a third book. What do you think is both the most unexpected best thing about being a writer in your career thus far, and also the most kind of unexpected worst thing, sort of most difficult thing about it?
Yeah. Okay. So the best thing, what I really like is like almost everything in like if almost everything in life can kind of feed into writing, and then writing kind of cross illuminates your life. Right. And so it's like just walking down the street, looking at people, being in a conversation with a stranger, going to a weird restaurant, like even experiences that can be kind of like negative, for other people, like, oh, the food was bad, the people were weird. If the food is bad in the right way, or the people are weird in the right way, like that can be a gold mine. And like, maybe you have a stomach ache after, but you can kind of pick stuff up. You know what I mean? And then it charges your day-to-day life. And I think it imbues things with a kind of meaning, know? And I think it just helps tune you to like, what's going on, like you can, cause it's like, I think most forms you distill them and they kind of become about their medium. And I don't mean that in a simplistic way. Like painting becomes about seeing, music becomes about listening, on some level. And I think, that's true with writing too. It's like, it becomes about speaking and listening. And I think it helps you appreciate that kind of like dimension to living.
But just to build on that.
Does that make sense? I don't know.
It does make sense. But I thought you were going to say something different with writing, is that I just feel like, and I'm so biased because I love writing and I am a writer. And so I always want to say it's the best art form. But I thought where you were going to go with that is that, while music can become about listening and painting can become about seeing, writing to me seems like the most open-ended. It's sort of, it can be about any sense. It can be about any experience in your life.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's like, and novels especially, and I mean, we are biased, right? But like, there's the amount of absorption they can kind of withstand is insane, right? Like, you can change the form, you can change the structure. They can be booklets, they can be massive tomes, and they're really there to kind of, I think, match the shapes of ideas and feelings. So I love that. And also, you don't need, like, film is great. Film is so immediate, At the same time, you need like a little army to make a film, or you need some like pretty good stuff. And it's like, you can literally, I outlined Sucker, I think, on a guest check booklet, those guest checks. I was working at a diner. It was a slow night. And I just like had the beginning. And so I was like, oh, the second chapter could be, third chapter could be, you know what I mean? And it's like, you can do that. You can't really, shoot your film.
Yeah, it's very democratic that way.
In the walk-in. Yeah.
All right. And then quickly, what about the hardest thing about being a writer?
I do think, even as you get the things you want, right, there's always a baseline shift in everything in life where it's like, could have gotten that better thing. But like, writing is very kind of rejection oriented. Like, you just have to, like, if you're out there, if you're watching this, it's like, you just have to kind of like say, oh, every time I'm rejected, it's just me bumping into the real thing. You know what I mean? Like, that's what being a writer is. All of your heroes, everyone you admire, they're all getting rejected all of the time. They're always struggling to get their books out there. And I think, if you're weak, maybe you're a little hungover one of these days, maybe shit isn't going so well, that rejection can like just hit in a way that just hurts. You know what I mean? Like, it's very personal. a short
know
stories
just what
in
you
your little
mean.
submittable file for like a
Yeah.
year, and you're like, the McSweeney's is gonna take it, man. And they don't. And of course, they don't fucking care.
I know all about the McSweeney's is going to take it, man, feeling. That is a very specific feeling that we all have. And, you know, what was I going to say? Oh, yeah, there's this kind of old saying that, like, you know, you only got to bat 300 to get in the Hall of Fame. Like, people just say that about lots of different things. I mean, to get in the Hall of Fame of writing, I feel like you got to bat about 10. Like 10 out of 1,000, you know, instead of 300 out of 1,000.
I say, like, if you get a short story published that year in a good enough, like a goodish place, place, it's a good year for a short story. You know what I'm saying? Like,
if you get one yes for every 100 no's, like, you are like, you're on the right path.
Good job. Hey, great job. Yeah. But I also think, you know, those humiliations, they make you like kind of not an asshole.
They do.
You know, you move through life completely lubricated, like the narrator of this book. It turns you into an asshole. You got to suffer a little bit.
It does.
You know,
and it gives you kind of a philosophy of life, or kind of like, you know, a kind of idea of like the amount of work you need to put in to get something good out of life. It totally skews that. Where I think like a healthy amount of rejection, you sort of get the feeling like, okay, well, I probably didn't work hard enough on that.
Well, it's good to have professional ambition. This is something my wife says, like, it's good to have professional ambition. You need creative ambition. You know, you have to have other kind of like, oh, this year I'm going to try this thing in my work, and not make it just about publication or something. You have to really, you know, have other milestones for yourself.
It's true. And I sometimes tell people, you know, who ask me about, you know, should I write this book or something? And sometimes the advice I give them is like, try to think of a book you'd want to write that, like, researching that book and going through the process of writing that book would be something that would be edifying in and of itself, even if the book doesn't get published. Like, it's a body of knowledge that's just good for you to know about, or that you'd be interested in anyway, you know?
Yeah. Do you want to live there for a year or 2 or 3?
Right. Okay, let's quickly. We've gone on here a long time. Time has flown by here. Let's just take a few questions if we can. All right. There are a lot of novels that pillory capitalism. Do you think capitalism can ever be a force for good? And if not capitalism, then what?
Okay. Yeah. Wow. We're gonna get into my like economic vision of the world.
Okay.
Like, I would say that like. You know, I don't know if like the stock market can be like a force for good. You know what I'm saying? I don't know if like publicly kind of owned or traded companies can be a force for good. I don't think so. I do think you can have like markets for things like, oh, you want to sell some eggs or whatever. And you know what I'm saying? Like, you can buy and sell things, like real things in a kind of material way, or services or whatever. But I do think that like kind of accumulation of capital that flows kind of behind our lives is just not good. And so, you know, I kind of envision a society where like we have more of a social safety net that kind of takes the lets us pump the brakes a little. I think if like, you know, people had a little more and could like get a little more out of the contract of obeying all these rules and paying all these bills, there'd be less tension, there'd be less violence, there'd be less polarization. You know, it just turned the temperature down a little bit. Yeah. So I just think like, you know, taking care of marginalized people, maybe if we built our society up from that, we'd be in a much better place, a much more comfortable place for everybody. You know?
Yeah. Well, it's a long way from where we're at.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, that's the best answer I can give, you know.
Yeah, I know. I struggle with it too. I mean, like, having covered, you know, venture capital and startups myself. I mean, you see that, like, actually, I mean, you know, selling shares of a company. I mean, you do see these great companies. Like, let's say something that seems like more, I don't know, sort of something that one could get behind, like solar power or something, right? Well, how does a solar power company get funding? Well, they have to go out and raise venture capital money, and there has to be like a market for that company. And so I have such a hard time kind of, while I like sympathize with your point of view and like, I want to be there, I'm also just like, well, how do we like also invent good things without these massive markets and ownership structures of companies? I don't know. It's beyond me.
Yeah, you know, I do think it used to be more incumbent on the government to invest in things that have like a more obvious kind of social good. And, you know, the stock market, it crashes every 8 to 12 years like clockwork. And then the government has to bail out all of these companies anyway. You know what I mean? So it's like we're paying for it on some level. Like
Right.
we are
Right.
kind of the shareholders of a lot of these companies
Right.
and the level
Right.
of
Right.
taxes. So I don't know. Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you. It's murky. It's complicated. Don't get me
Yeah,
wrong.
I'm
I don't
with
have
you.
like all the answers, but that's, I think we could start there.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Let's do one more question from the audience. Okay. Here we go. Do you have a favorite spiritual writer?
Ooh. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So just in the kind of like history of, I'll give two answers here, and like one is like hardcore a novel, the other is
Mhm.
like a religious text. I really like this book by an anonymous author uh, in kind of the late Middle Ages, The Cloud of Unknowing.
Oh yeah.
It's just kind of a practical guide for meditation and
Mhm.
spiritual edification. A lot of it is based off Dionysius the Areopagite, who is another just really cool figure. He's like a 5th or 6th century Syrian monk. But this is a guy, almost 1,000 years later.
Mhm.
And it's just like a very beautiful guide to imageless prayer.
Mm.
And you can feel this person there's something about the way it's written that just feels very um, like sincere,
Mm.
that they're actually looking
Mhm.
out for your edification and that they're working with a kind of creativity in their own
Mhm.
spirituality, right? That they're kind of like playing and exploring this thing. So that's a cool one for me. And then like a book that is spiritual, but kind of in a more obscure way. I really like The End of Vandalism by Tom Drury.
Mm.
You ever read
I
this
haven't
book?
heard. No, I haven't heard of that one.
It's all set in a county in Iowa, but it has this kind of sub theme or this motif about paths and kind of crisscrossing these paths. It feels
Mm.
like, I don't know, it has a spiritual substrate that I just think is great, and it's funny as hell. So
Dan, do you ever think that you would go in that direction with your own writing towards something that is more like Cloud of Unknowing, something that is like not really a novel per se, but just more a spirituality kind of book?
I could see that down the road, maybe. I don't
Yeah.
know. I think, right now this is kind of where I'm at, like I'm thinking a lot in this next thing about non-human life
Mm.
and these ideas of like kind of drifting consciousnesses.
Hmm.
I don't know. Yeah, I know that's a little woo woo. So I definitely am getting into like, and I have another project that has a lot of medieval ideas about viriditas, the
Mm.
green truth, this idea about the renewal of the natural world.
Oh, okay.
That some popes wrote about, Hildegard of Bingen wrote about.
Hmm.
So like, I don't know, I maybe down the road, I could see something like that, or at least like some essays,
Oh, that
like Marilyn
Viriditas
Robinson or
idea.
something.
Yeah.
I
Oh,
know. Yeah. You see what I mean?
I do see what you mean. I would love to read
So
about Viriditas. I'd never heard that phrase before, but I already like it. I mean, it just sort of means like
it's
green
cool.
truth, right? Is that what
Yeah,
that
it's
word
like
means?
veridity and veritas, and it's kind of accounts for like the resurrection, but also like fields growing back after the
Hmm.
winter,
Hmm.
the curiosity in the mind of a novice nun,
Hmm.
because Hildegard of Bingen is like human fecundity,
Mm.
things like that. So it's just like, I don't know, it's this beautiful idea that gives me kind of hope in the face of ecological destruction.
Same. I'm already
Yeah.
feeling a
So
little bit of that hope right now. All right,
okay.
Dan, thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah,
This has been
it's been an
awesome.
absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.
I knew it would be great. Folks, the book is great. It's called Sucker by Dan Hornsby. Dan, I have one last question before we go, which
Let's
is
do it.
a question I ask all the people who come on the show, which is this. Just imagine, if you will, that there is a perfect reader for your book, an ideal reader. And this book
Okay.
has kind of gotten all your references, and there are a lot of references in this book, but I kind of gotten all the references, is just sort of sympathetic to the kind of philosophy behind the book in the best possible way. It's just picking up everything you're putting down. Now imagine this ideal reader has just finished Sucker. They close it, they put it on their lap. Describe for me in a phrase or even just one word, what is the feeling that this reader has?
Yeah. Okay. I always love that kind of gap when you finish something. It's like that 7 seconds. You know what I mean? I would want someone to be like, "Oh, I see." That kind of thing where you're like, "Oh." Do you know what I mean?
I
Where it's
do.
like
I
kind of
do.
like
Aha.
when you realize you've set someone else up for a joke and then they kind of
Mm.
do the joke on you. And you're like,
Yes.
oh, that
Yes.
feeling, and just a little bit of like, Yeah, I don't know. Does that make sense?
It does.
Kind of like,
book, it does have that kind of ending. It does.
Okay.
I mean, it definitely said there's like this big payoff, I think, on the last few pages where you're like, oh.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm going for. So I'm glad to hear it.
That's awesome.
Maybe you're that guy for me. Maybe you're that guy.
I might be. I think I've done. I think it's like the 103rd episode I've ever done. This is the first time anybody's ever given me like a wordless answer to that question. I love it.
Okay, good. That really shows my lack of gifts, I suppose. But what can you do?
All right. Well, Dan, again, this has been so wonderful, folks. The link is in the chat to buy Sucker by Dan Hornsby. Please open up a browser, buy a few copies. It is amazing. It is funny, and it is right on point on the super interesting, trending genre of the kind of like, startup, hubristic collapse, as we said, with this touch of the speculative in it, which just keeps you on your toes. So full endorsement of this book. Dan, thank you for coming on Thoughtful Bro.
Thanks for having me.
All right, folks, we'll see you next week, and have a great end of your summer. Bye-bye.